Before I begin, I need to say something. What you're about to hear isn't easy for me to share. I never thought I would tell this story to anyone. But there was a moment, lost in the wilderness of northern Minnesota, when I understood that some stories need to be told, even if it costs everything to relive them. My name is Robert Mitchell, and I'm 43 years old. For the past 18 months, I've been living alone in a cabin I built with my own hands, deep in the Superior National Forest. The nearest town, Grand Marais, is 37 miles away through winding dirt roads that become impassable during heavy snowfall. I chose this isolation deliberately. After my divorce, after losing my job at the paper mill, after watching my father die slowly in a sterile hospital room, I needed silence. I needed to disappear from a world that had become too loud, too demanding, too painful. The cabin sits on the edge of a small lake called Mirror Pond. Though you won't find that name on any official map, it's what the old-timer who sold me the land called it, and the name fits perfectly. On calm mornings, the water reflects the sky so perfectly that you lose track of where the world ends and heaven begins. The structure itself is simple. One main room with a stone fireplace, a small bedroom, and a kitchen barely large enough for one person. I installed solar panels and a small wind turbine for electricity, dug my own well, and learned to live on what the forest could provide, supplemented by monthly supply runs to town. My days followed a rhythm as predictable as the seasons. I woke before dawn, started a fire if it was cold, and made coffee using beans I'd learned to roast myself. Breakfast was usually oatmeal with dried berries I'd gathered and preserved, sometimes supplemented by fish I'd caught the evening before. Mornings were for maintenance, chopping wood, checking the solar panels, tending to the small vegetable garden I'd managed to coax from the rocky soil. Afternoons were for hunting, fishing, or gathering, depending on the season. Evenings belonged to reading by lamplight, writing in my journal, and listening to the forest settle into night. The isolation was exactly what I'd wanted. The closest neighbors were seasonal visitors who came to a fishing lodge 12 miles south, and they only appeared during summer months. For most of the year, I shared the wilderness with deer, black bears, wolves, and countless smaller creatures. I learned their patterns, respected their spaces, and found a peace I hadn't known existed. The silence wasn't empty. It was full of wind through pine needles, water lapping against shore, the distant call of loons, and my own breathing. For the first time in years, I could hear myself think. The change began in late October of my second year. The air had turned sharp with the promise of winter, and I'd been working frantically to finish my preparations, splitting extra wood, weatherproofing the cabin's exterior, smoking the last of the fish I'd caught before the lake would freeze. The northern lights had been particularly active that month, painting the sky in sheets of green and blue that made the nights feel alive with electricity. It was on a Thursday evening, October 26th, that I first noticed something watching me. I'd just finished securing a tarp over my woodpile when the sensation hit me like a physical weight. You know that feeling when someone's staring at you from across a room? It was exactly like that, except amplified tenfold. The hairs on my neck stood up, and my stomach clenched with primitive alarm. I straightened slowly and scanned the tree line. The cabin sits in a natural clearing about 50 yards across, surrounded by dense forest of pine, birch, and maple. The trees formed a wall of shadows in the fading light, and at first I saw nothing unusual. But there, between two massive pine trees on the northern edge of the clearing, something was different. The shadows seemed deeper, more solid. As I stared, trying to convince myself it was just my imagination, the shadow shifted slightly. My rational mind offered explanations. A bear, maybe, or a moose. Large animals weren't uncommon, and twilight often played tricks with perception. But something about the shape was wrong. It stood too upright, too still, too purposeful. I grabbed the LED flashlight from my belt and aimed it toward the tree line. but the beam didn't reach far enough to illuminate whatever was watching me. By the time I went inside to get a more powerful light, the presence was gone. That night, I lay awake listening to the forest with new ears. Every crack of settling wood, every rustle of wind through leaves, every distant owl call made me tense. I told myself I was being paranoid, that months of isolation were finally getting to me, but deep down, in the part of my brain that evolution had hardened for survival, I knew something had changed. The next evening, it was back. This time I was ready. I'd positioned a powerful spotlight near the cabin door, and I'd spent the afternoon reinforcing my memory of local wildlife behavior. Bears were preparing for hibernation and would be focused on feeding, not stalking humans. Wolves rarely showed interest in solitary people, especially not in this obvious way. Moose could be aggressive during rutting season, but they didn't lurk in shadows. As darkness fell, I pretended to go about my normal routine while keeping my senses alert for that feeling of being observed. It came just after 8 o'clock, settling over me like a cold blanket. This time, when I turned toward the northern tree line, I didn't hesitate. I triggered the spotlight immediately. The beam cut through the darkness and illuminated the space between the pine trees. For just a moment, maybe 2 seconds, I saw something that made my brain struggle to process what my eyes were reporting. It was tall, impossibly tall, with long limbs that seemed too thin for its frame. The shape was roughly humanoid, but wrong in ways that made my stomach turn. Before I could focus on details, it was gone, melting back into the forest so quickly I might have imagined the entire thing. I kept the light trained on that spot for another 10 minutes, but nothing moved. The forest had gone completely silent. No insects, no small animals rustling through undergrowth, no wind through branches. Even the lake behind me seemed to have stopped lapping against the shore. The quiet was so complete, it felt like being inside a vacuum. Sleep didn't come that night. I sat in my chair by the window with a loaded rifle across my knees, watching the tree line until dawn. Every shadow seemed to hold potential threat. Every movement of branches in the wind looked deliberate and menacing. By morning, exhaustion had mixed with doubt. Maybe the isolation really was affecting my mind. Maybe I'd been alone too long and was starting to see things that weren't there. But when I went outside to start my morning routine, I found tracks. They were unlike anything I'd ever seen, and I'd spent enough time in the wilderness to recognize the prints of every animal in the region. These impressions in the soft earth near the tree line were enormous, easily 18 inches long, and shaped roughly like human footprints, but elongated and narrow. The depth suggested incredible weight, and the spacing between prints indicated a stride of nearly 6 feet. Whatever had made them had stood exactly where I'd aimed the spotlight. I knelt beside the clearest print and tried to make sense of what I was seeing. The basic shape was human-like, with what appeared to be 5 toe impressions, but everything was wrong. The toes were too long, ending in what looked like claw marks in the earth. The heel was narrow and deep, as if the creature walked on the balls of its feet. Most disturbing of all, there were only 3 prints visible before the trail vanished at the edge of the rocky ground near the tree line. I spent that day researching everything I could find on my laptop about unusual animal tracks in northern Minnesota. Bear prints could be large, but these were far too narrow and showed no palm pad. Human prints would never be this size or show claw marks. I even looked up hoax possibilities, people wearing fake feet or stilts, but the depth and spacing ruled out any normal human explanation. The more I researched, the more unsettled I became. I found references to Native American legends about creatures called Wendigos or Wendigos, cannibalistic beings associated with winter, famine, and madness. The descriptions varied, but most spoke of giants with elongated limbs, supernatural strength, and an insatiable hunger. I'd always dismissed such stories as folklore, cautionary tales meant to teach lessons about survival and community. But sitting alone in my cabin, Staring at digital photos of impossible footprints, folklore began to feel less dismissible. That evening, I made preparations. I charged every light I owned, loaded both my rifle and shotgun, and positioned them strategically around the cabin. I set up my camera on a tripod by the window, aimed at the spot where the creature had appeared. If I was losing my mind, at least I'd have evidence of my hallucinations. If something real was out there, maybe I'd finally get proof. The waiting was torture. Every minute crawled by with agonizing slowness. I found myself jumping at sounds I'd heard hundreds of times before. The settling of wood as temperature dropped, the distant howl of a wolf pack, the splash of a beaver in the lake. By 9 o'clock, I was beginning to think my visitor had moved on to other territory. Then the feeling returned. This time it was stronger, more oppressive. The sensation of being watched was so intense it made my skin crawl and my breathing shallow. I forced myself to remain calm, to wait for the right moment before triggering the lights and camera. Through the window, I could see the tree line as a black mass against the slightly lighter sky. A branch snapped. The sound came from the northern edge of the clearing, sharp and clear in the night air. Then another branch and another, as if something large was moving through the forest with deliberate steps. I gripped my rifle tighter and pressed my eye to the camera's viewfinder. The footsteps stopped at the tree line. For several minutes, nothing moved. I could feel its presence like electricity in the air, but I couldn't see anything in the darkness between the trees. My finger hovered over the button that would trigger the spotlight and start the camera recording. Then it stepped into the clearing. I've spent countless hours since that night trying to find words adequate to describe what I saw, but human language wasn't designed for something so far outside normal experience. The creature that emerged from the tree line was tall beyond belief, at least 10 feet, maybe 12. Its body was humanoid in basic structure, but stretched and distorted as if someone had taken a person and pulled them like taffy. The limbs were impossibly long and thin, jointed in ways that seemed to allow movement in any direction. Its torso was narrow and elongated, covered in what looked like dirty, matted fur or hair. But it was the head that made my soul recoil. The skull was roughly human in shape, but larger, with a pronounced brow and deep-set eye sockets that held points of pale light. The jaw was extended into something resembling a muzzle, filled with teeth that gleamed white in the starlight. Antlers, massive, elaborate antlers like those of an enormous elk, sprouted from its skull and stretched at least 3 feet in each direction. I triggered the spotlight and camera simultaneously. The creature turned toward the light with movements that were too quick and too fluid for something so large. Those pale eyes fixed on me through the window, and I felt a chill that went deeper than mere cold. We stared at each other across the clearing, predator and prey, nightmare and dreamer, something ancient and something terribly modern. Then it spoke. The voice that emerged from that impossible throat was like grinding stone mixed with wind through dead leaves. The words were English, but shaped by a mouth never meant for human speech. Robert Mitchell. Hearing my name spoken by that thing nearly made me drop the rifle. My hands shook so violently I could barely keep the creature in the camera's frame. It knew who I was. Somehow this entity from the deepest wilderness knew my name. "I have been watching," it continued, each word deliberate and careful. "You live alone. You do not belong to the world of humans anymore." I wanted to run, to hide, to wake up from what had to be a nightmare. Instead, I found my voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "What do you want?" The creature tilted its head, and I heard what might have been laughter, a sound like wind through a graveyard. "Want? I want what I have always wanted, what my kind has always needed." It took a step closer to the cabin, and I could see more details in the harsh glare of the spotlight. The fur that covered its body was not fur at all, but what looked like dried vegetation, moss, and fragments of bark. It was as if the forest itself had taken shape and learned to walk. I want to understand why you choose this isolation, why you turn away from your own kind. The question caught me off guard. I had expected threats, demands, violence. Instead, this creature, this Wendigo, if that's what it was, seemed genuinely curious about my choices. I needed quiet, I said, still keeping the rifle trained on center mass, though I doubted any human weapon would stop something that size. The world became too much. Yes, it said, and there was something almost approving in its voice. Too much noise, too much hunger that cannot be satisfied, too much wanting of things that do not nourish. It took another step closer, and I could smell it now. Earth and decay, pine needles and something else, something wild and ancient. You understand what others do not, the emptiness of their feeding. I began to realize this conversation was not going the direction I had expected. This wasn't a monster threatening me. It was something else entirely, something that saw kinship in my choice to leave civilization behind. "Are you going to hurt me?" I asked. The creature was quiet for a long moment, and when it spoke again, its voice had changed. There was sadness in it, and weariness that felt older than mountains. "I have hurt many. I have taken and consumed and never been satisfied. It is the curse of what I became." It gestured with one impossibly long arm toward the forest around us. "But here, in this quiet place, watching you live simply and take only what you need, I remember what it was like before the hunger consumed everything else." "What were you before?" Another pause, longer this time. When the Wendigo spoke again, its voice was barely above a whisper. "I was like you, a man who sought solitude, but I was not strong enough to resist what the wilderness offered. I gave in to hungers I should have denied, made choices that transformed me into this." It looked down at its own elongated form, with what I could only interpret as disgust. "Now I am neither human nor animal, but something caught between, always hungry and never able to return to what I was." The weight of that confession settled between us. I lowered my rifle slightly, though I didn't set it aside entirely. "How long have you been like this?" "Time moves differently when you become something like me. Seasons blur together, years pass like days, or days pass like years. I think, perhaps 80 years, maybe more. I stopped counting when I stopped hoping it would end." I stared across the clearing at this impossible being, trying to process what I was hearing. This wasn't just a monster or a legend come to life. This was a person, or had been a person, trapped in a form that represented everything they had lost. "Why are you telling me this?" The Wendigo's pale eyes met mine through the camera viewfinder. "Because you are walking the same path I walked. You seek isolation, reject the demands of your kind, live apart from the world that created you. I see the anger in how you chop wood, the sorrow in how you sit by the lake at sunset. You are feeding on solitude the way I once fed on flesh." The comparison made me recoil. "I'm not hurting anyone. I'm not—" "Not yet," it interrupted. "But isolation can be its own kind of hunger. Feed on it too long, consume nothing but your own pain and anger, and you risk becoming something that can never return to the human world." It took a step backward, toward the tree line. "I have watched others make this choice. Some find balance, others—" It didn't need to finish that sentence. "What do you want from me?" "I want you to remember that even in solitude, you are still human. Do not let the wilderness consume your connections to your own kind completely. Visit the town, speak to other people, hold on to the parts of yourself that can still feel compassion and community." The Wendigo paused, and when it continued, its voice carried a weight of absolute certainty. Because once you cross the line I crossed, there is no returning. With that, it melted back into the tree line, moving with a silence that seemed impossible for something so large. I kept the spotlight trained on the area where it had vanished, but the forest had already swallowed it completely. The normal sounds of night gradually returned. Insects, small animals, wind through branches, as if the world itself was slowly exhaling after holding its breath. I remained by the window until dawn, rifle in hand, watching and listening. But the Wendigo didn't return, and when morning light revealed the clearing, there were no new tracks to be found. If not for the video recording on my camera, I might have convinced myself the entire encounter had been an elaborate dream born of isolation and stress. But the recording was real, and the creature's words echoed in my mind as I went about my morning routine. For the first time since moving to the wilderness, I found myself questioning whether my chosen isolation was healthy or sustainable. Was I fleeing from the world's problems, or was I becoming part of a larger problem myself? That afternoon, I made a decision that would have seemed impossible just 24 hours earlier. I loaded supplies into my truck and drove to Grand Marais for the first time in 3 months. The town felt alien after so long in the wilderness. Too bright, too loud, too full of unnecessary motion. But I forced myself to stop at the general store to make small talk with the clerk about weather and local news. I ate dinner at a small diner and actually engaged in conversation with an elderly fisherman about lake conditions. It was awkward and uncomfortable, but it was also necessary. The Wendigo had been right about one thing. Isolation could become its own kind of consumption, and I had been feeding on solitude and self-pity for far too long. When I returned to the cabin that evening, I half expected to find the creature waiting for me. Instead, I found something else entirely. Arranged on my doorstep were 3 objects: a perfectly preserved pine cone, a piece of birch bark with intricate natural patterns, and a small stone polished smooth by water. There was no note, no explanation, but somehow I understood these were gifts, tokens of approval for the choice I'd made that day. The Wendigo returned the following night, but this time the encounter was different. Instead of emerging into the clearing where I could see it clearly, it remained at the edge of the tree line, a shadow among shadows. When it spoke, its voice carried across the distance like wind. "You went to the town." "I did." "Good. It is important to remember what you are choosing to step away from, not just what you're running from." We talked for perhaps an hour that night, though conversation isn't really the right word for what passed between us. The Wendigo would ask questions or make observations about human nature, solitude, and the relationship between civilization and wilderness. I found myself opening up about things I'd never discussed with anyone: the anger that had driven me away from society, the guilt over my father's death, the fear that I was fundamentally unsuited for human companionship. The creature listened without judgment, occasionally offering insights that revealed a deep understanding of human psychology. It became clear that whatever transformation had changed its body, its mind retained much of its original human intelligence and empathy. "You speak as if you understand people," I said during one of these conversations. "I was human for 37 years before I became this. Those memories do not fade, even when everything else about yourself is lost." There was profound sadness in its voice. I remember what it felt like to love someone, to worry about paying bills, to laugh at simple jokes. I remember the taste of coffee and the feeling of clean sheets. These memories are what make the transformation so painful. You never forget what you've lost. Do you ever regret becoming what you are? Every moment of every day, but regret is useless. It changes nothing. What matters is what I choose to do with what I've become. As the weeks passed, these nighttime conversations became routine. The Wendigo would appear at the tree line after dark. and we would talk until dawn began to lighten the sky. Sometimes the topics were philosophical, discussions about human nature, morality, the relationship between individual needs and community responsibility. Other times they were practical. The creature had an encyclopedic knowledge of wilderness survival and shared techniques for everything from predicting weather to identifying edible plants. I began to look forward to these encounters, strange as that sounds. The Wendigo's perspective on human behavior was unique, informed by decades of observation from the outside. It helped me understand patterns in my own thinking that I'd never recognized before. More importantly, it challenged my assumptions about isolation, community, and what it meant to live a meaningful life. "You have been alone for 18 months, it observed one particularly cold November night. But you have not been lonely until recently. What changed?" The question forced me to examine my own emotions more carefully. I think I was angry for so long that the anger kept me company. It gave me energy and purpose. But lately, the anger has been fading, and I'm realizing how empty everything feels without it. Anger can be a fuel, but it burns dirty and leaves ash behind. What will you burn when the anger is gone? I didn't have an answer to that question, but I began to think about it seriously. What did I want my life to become? Was permanent isolation really a solution? Or was it just another form of the same avoidance that had created my problems in the first place? The Wendigo seemed to sense my internal struggle. There is a difference between choosing solitude and being chosen by it. You came here by choice, seeking healing and perspective. That is healthy. But if you stay too long, if you let the isolation become your entire identity, then solitude chooses you instead. And once that happens, returning to the human world becomes nearly impossible. How long do I have before that happens? It is different for everyone. For me, it took 3 years before I crossed the line. But I was weaker than you, more damaged by what I was running from. You still have time to choose your path deliberately, instead of letting circumstances choose for you. These conversations forced me to confront uncomfortable truths about my situation. I had come to the wilderness to heal from trauma and disappointment, but somewhere along the way, my healing retreat had begun to transform into permanent exile. The Wendigo's presence, paradoxically, was helping me maintain my connection to humanity by forcing me to examine my choices from an outside perspective. The gifts continued to appear on my doorstep irregularly, always natural objects arranged with obvious care and intention. A cluster of red maple leaves still vibrant despite the advancing season. 3 smooth pebbles arranged in a triangle. A fallen bird's nest lined with soft moss. Each one seemed to represent something different about the balance between solitude and connection, between taking from nature and giving back to it. I began leaving gifts in return, small tokens that represented my own understanding of our strange relationship. A carved wooden bird that had taken me 3 evenings to complete, a thermos of coffee left steaming on the porch, a small pile of books I thought the creature might enjoy, though I was never sure if it could still read in its transformed state. The books disappeared by morning, and several nights later the Wendigo mentioned specific passages and ideas from them during our conversation. Whatever physical changes it had undergone, its intellectual capabilities remained intact. As winter deepened and the first snows began to fall, our conversations took on a more urgent tone. The Wendigo explained that its kind were most active during the coldest months, when the line between survival and consumption became thinnest. Winter strips away pretenses and reveals what people truly are, it said one night as ice crystals formed in the air between us. Those who are strong enough to face hardship without losing their humanity become stronger. Those who are not. It gestured at its own transformed body. What happened to you during your winter? The Wendigo was quiet for so long, I thought it wouldn't answer. When it finally spoke, its voice carried the weight of decades of regret. I had been living alone for 2 years in a cabin much like yours, perhaps 60 miles northwest of here. A family traveling through the area became lost in a blizzard. They sought shelter at my cabin, a man, woman, and 2 children, all of them half frozen and desperate. It paused, and I could see its elongated form trembling, though whether from cold or emotion I couldn't tell. I let them in, fed them, gave them warmth and safety. For 3 days we waited for the storm to pass. Another long pause, but I had not spoken to another human being in months. The company was intoxicating. When the storm ended and they prepared to leave, I couldn't bear the thought of returning to solitude. I wanted them to stay. I felt my stomach clench as I began to understand where this story was leading. I convinced them that the roads were still dangerous, that they should wait another day or 2, then another week. I found reasons to delay their departure, convinced myself I was protecting them from hazards that didn't exist. The Wendigo's voice had become barely audible. The woman began to suspect that something was wrong. She tried to leave with her children one morning while I was out hunting. I stopped them. The clearing fell silent except for the whisper of wind through bare branches. I told myself I was saving them from freezing to death, but the truth was simpler and more terrible. I had become so hungry for human connection that I was willing to imprison them to satisfy that need. And when they continued to resist, when they made it clear they would rather risk death than remain with me, the creature's voice broke. I fed my hunger in the most literal way possible. The confession hung in the frigid air between us like a physical presence. I felt sick, terrified, and strangely grateful all at once. The Wendigo had trusted me with the darkest moment of its existence, and in doing so, had shown me exactly what kind of abyss I was walking toward. After that, the transformation began. It took months to complete, but from the moment I made that choice, I was no longer human. The wilderness claimed me as punishment for violating the most basic law of community and survival. You do not consume other people to satisfy your own needs. Why are you telling me this? Because I see the same hunger in you that I felt in myself, not for flesh, but for connection, for purpose, for reasons to justify your choices. You are feeding on solitude and righteousness, convincing yourself that your isolation is noble rather than selfish. The Wendigo took a step closer to the tree line, and I could see its pale eyes reflecting the light from my cabin windows. But hunger is hunger, regardless of what feeds it. And if you are not careful, your need for isolation will transform into something that makes return impossible. That night, after the Wendigo disappeared into the forest, I sat by my fire and forced myself to confront the truth in its words. I had been telling myself that my isolation was about healing, about finding peace and clarity away from the chaos of modern life. But increasingly, it had become about superiority, about feeling righteous in my rejection of a world I deemed unworthy of my participation. I was consuming my own sense of moral elevation the same way the Wendigo had once consumed human flesh, and like all forms of consumption, it was never enough. I always needed to find new reasons why the human world was corrupt, why my neighbors were selfish, why society was beyond redemption. My isolation had become a kind of addiction, and like all addictions, it was slowly poisoning my capacity for genuine connection and empathy. The realization was terrifying and liberating at the same time. The next morning, I made another trip to Grand Marais, but this time my goal was different. Instead of simply going through the motions of human contact, I actively sought opportunities to be helpful and engaged. I volunteered to help an elderly woman carry groceries to her car. I spent an hour talking with a young father about the challenges of raising children in a small town. I even accepted an invitation to join a group of locals for coffee and found myself genuinely enjoying their company. None of these interactions were profound or life-changing in themselves, but together they represented a choice to engage with humanity rather than judge it from a distance. They were small steps back from the edge of the abyss the Wendigo had shown me. When I returned to the cabin that evening, I found another gift waiting, a single white feather, pristine and perfect against the dark wood of my porch. But this time there was also something else, a note written in spidery handwriting on a piece of birch bark. "You are choosing well. Continue choosing." That night's conversation felt different from all the others. The Wendigo seemed less melancholy, more hopeful. We talked about the difference between solitude and loneliness, between retreat and exile, between choosing your community and being chosen by your circumstances. Community is not about finding perfect people, it observed. It is about finding people whose imperfections complement your own. You left the human world because you could not tolerate its flaws, but perfection is not what makes community valuable. What does? The willingness to remain connected despite disappointment, to choose cooperation over judgment, to see other people's struggles as opportunities for compassion rather than evidence of their unworthiness. The Wendigo paused, and when it continued, its voice carried a note of something approaching peace. I lost my humanity because I made other people's needs secondary to my own desires. You risk losing yours by making your own needs the only ones that matter. As winter deepened, our conversations became less frequent but more intense. The Wendigo was preparing for something. I could sense it in the way it spoke about endings and beginnings, about cycles of transformation and renewal. When I asked directly what was happening, it gave me an answer I didn't expect. My kind exists in a state of perpetual hunger, always seeking but never finding satisfaction. But these conversations with you have reminded me of something I had forgotten. Sometimes the hunger can be satisfied not by consuming more, but by choosing to give something away. I don't understand. For 80 years I have taken from the world lives, peace, hope. I have been a creature of pure need, never offering anything in return. The Wendigo's form seemed more solid in the moonlight, more real than it had ever appeared before. But helping you avoid my fate has given me something I thought was lost forever, a sense of purpose that doesn't involve consumption. What are you saying? I'm saying that some hungers can be satisfied by the choice to stop feeding them. Some transformations can be reversed by the decision to value something more than your own needs. The next morning brought the heaviest snowfall I'd experienced since moving to the wilderness. The storm lasted 3 days, trapping me inside the cabin with nothing but books, my own thoughts, and the memory of the Wendigo's words. When the weather finally cleared and I was able to venture outside, I found the forest transformed into something magical and pristine. But there were no tracks around the clearing, no sense of being watched, no gifts on the doorstep. The Wendigo didn't return that night, or the next, or the one after that. As days passed without contact, I began to worry that something had happened to it. Despite the strangeness of our relationship, the creature had become an important part of my life in the wilderness. Its absence felt like losing a friend. On the 7th night after the storm, I called out to the forest, hoping to re-establish contact. My voice echoed across the clearing and into the trees, but no response came. The silence felt different than before, not oppressive or watchful, but simply empty. It wasn't until 2 weeks later that I found answers. I had decided to snowshoe to a ridge several miles north of my cabin, partly for exercise and partly to search for any sign of the Wendigo. The trail was difficult, winding through dense forest and up steep slopes, but the effort felt good after so many days of confinement. Near the top of the ridge, I found something that made me stop in my tracks. Partially hidden by snow and fallen branches was what appeared to be human remains, but not in the way I initially feared. These bones were old, cleaned by weather and scavengers, arranged in a natural pattern that suggested peaceful death rather than violence. Nearby, half buried in the snow, I found a leather journal wrapped in oilcloth. The pages inside were filled with handwriting I recognized from the note on my doorstep, but the entries were dated decades earlier. As I read, I began to understand what I had discovered. The journal belonged to Thomas Erickson, a man who had come to the wilderness in 1942 seeking solitude after returning from the war. His early entries described experiences very similar to mine: the peace of isolation, the healing power of nature, the gradual recovery from trauma and disappointment. But as months turned to years, the tone of the writing changed. He became increasingly critical of human civilization, more convinced of his own superiority, more isolated from any form of community or connection. The final entries, written during his third winter alone, described his encounter with the lost family and the terrible choice that had transformed him into something no longer human. But they also revealed something else. Thomas had never stopped being aware of what he had become. The Wendigo I had been speaking with was not some separate entity that had consumed Thomas Erickson. It was Thomas himself, trapped in a form that reflected his deepest choices and regrets. Scattered around the remains were objects I recognized. The books I had left as gifts, the carved wooden bird, other small tokens of our strange friendship. It was clear that Thomas had come to this place deliberately, that he had chosen to end the curse that had defined the last 80 years of his existence. But there was one more thing among his possessions: a letter addressed to me. Robert. It began in that familiar, spidery handwriting. If you are reading this, then my choice has been completed, and my transformation has finally ended. Do not mourn what I have become. Celebrate what you have chosen not to become. Our conversations reminded me that redemption is always possible, even for those who believe they are beyond saving. By helping you find your way back to humanity, I was able to find mine as well. The hunger that drove me for so many years was finally satisfied not by consumption, but by the choice to give rather than take. You face the same choice I faced so many years ago, but you are stronger than I was. You have seen the consequences of letting isolation consume your capacity for connection. Use that knowledge wisely. Return to the world, Robert, not as you left it, but as you choose to engage with it now. Take the peace you have found in solitude, but do not let it become a fortress against compassion. The wilderness has taught you important lessons about simplicity, self-reliance, and the rhythms of the natural world. These are gifts that the human community needs. Remember that solitude is only valuable when it prepares you for meaningful connection. Isolation is only healing when it leads to greater capacity for love. Choose well. Choose often. Choose community over judgment, engagement over retreat, connection over purity. And if you ever find yourself walking too far down the path I walked, remember that it is never too late to choose differently. With gratitude for showing me the way home, Thomas Erickson, I sat on that snow-covered ridge for a long time, holding the letter and watching clouds move across the winter sky. The weight of Thomas's sacrifice, of his final gift to both me and the world, settled over me like a blanket. He had spent 80 years trapped by the consequences of a single terrible choice, but in the end he had found a way to transform even that into something redemptive. When I finally returned to the cabin, I knew my time in the wilderness was approaching its end, not because I was running away again, but because I was finally ready to engage with the world from a place of strength rather than anger or fear. I spent the remaining winter months preparing for reintegration into human society. I wrote extensively in my journal, processing everything I had learned from my time alone and from my unlikely friendship with Thomas. I planned how I might use the skills I'd developed in the wilderness, not just practical abilities like building and growing food, but deeper capacities for patience, observation, and acceptance of natural cycles. Most importantly, I practiced engaging with people during my increasingly frequent trips to Grand Marais. I volunteered at the local food bank. I helped elderly residents with snow removal and basic maintenance tasks. I attended community meetings and actually contributed ideas rather than just criticizing existing approaches. Each of these activities felt awkward at first, like learning to use muscles that had atrophied during my isolation. But gradually, they became more natural. I remembered how to listen without judgment, how to offer help without expecting recognition, how to disagree with someone's ideas without dismissing their worth as a person. By spring, I had developed genuine friendships with several people in town. These weren't the superficial connections I had fled from in my previous life, but relationships based on mutual respect, shared efforts, and acceptance of each other's imperfections. They reminded me that community wasn't about finding perfect people. It was about choosing to remain connected despite disappointment and difference. When May arrived and the last snow melted from the clearing around my cabin, I made my final decision. I would sell the property and move back to a community where I could contribute meaningfully to something larger than myself. Not the same community I had left. That would have been regression rather than growth, but a new place where I could apply what the wilderness and Thomas had taught me. I spent my last week at the cabin, completing a project I had been planning since finding Thomas's remains. Using materials from the forest and techniques he had taught me during our conversations, I built a small memorial cairn on the ridge where I had discovered his final resting place. It wasn't elaborate, just stones arranged in a spiral pattern around a single white pine sapling I had transplanted from near my cabin. But it felt like the right way to honor both his sacrifice and the transformation that our unlikely friendship had made possible. On my final evening at the cabin, I sat by the lake, watching the sunset and thinking about cycles of isolation and connection, consumption and giving, transformation and redemption. The water reflected the sky in perfect stillness, just as it had on my first morning in the wilderness. But I was no longer the same person who had sought refuge in that reflection. I had come to the forest angry, wounded, convinced that solitude was the only solution to a world that had disappointed me. I was leaving grateful, healed, and committed to engaging with human community from a place of wisdom rather than judgment. The Wendigo, Thomas, had shown me the ultimate consequences of letting isolation consume your capacity for connection. But he had also shown me that redemption was always possible, that even the deepest transformation could be reversed by the choice to value something more than your own needs. As darkness fell over the lake for the last time during my residency, I whispered a final thank you to the forest, to Thomas, and to whatever force had brought us together for those crucial conversations. Then I went inside to pack the last of my belongings and prepare for the journey back to the world of human community. I never saw the Wendigo again, but sometimes, during quiet moments in my new life, I remember Thomas's words about choosing well, choosing often, and choosing connection over isolation. His voice has become part of my internal compass, guiding me away from the comfortable patterns of judgment and withdrawal that once seemed so appealing. The cabin where I spent those transformative months now belongs to a young couple seeking their own retreat from urban stress. I hope they find the peace and clarity I discovered there. But I also hope they remember to return to the world when their healing is complete, carrying what they learned back to the human community that needs their gifts. Because in the end, that's what solitude is for, not to escape from life, but to prepare for living it more fully.